Gakkou Gurashi at its heart is magnanimous. It emphasizes a subjective view to a survival story, steadfast and intent on maintaining institutions. At the same time, it shows how fragile its inhabitants are when they fail, and they fail spectacularly, to uphold an old world's order. On a broader narrative level, I can respect Gakkou Gurashi's willingness to try. It has its compelling and arresting peaks from moment to moment, but overall it's a story that shows structural skill. And it accomplishes this in several ways. So the purpose of this review is not really to sell you this story as a product, but rather to defend the show, as well as an exercise of my own as to why I like it. So I wanted to talk about 4 things that seemed really interesting. Let's get started. At the heart of Gakkou Gurashi is the role of the institution. Megumi steadfastly argues that she's a teacher. The club upholds the facade so that everyone doesn't go crazy. Yori's responsibility as the caretaker of the girls depends on her position as the president. The final sequence has the girls graduating. Each little tidbit that harkens back to old institutions imply 2 things. 1, the girls themselves have not fully acclimated to the rigors of the harsh world around them, and 2, institutions are ultimately much more difficult to remove than we think. And while it seems so far-fetched, it's actually quite true. At times of immense political, spiritual, and psychological upheaval, institutions are decidedly powerful and immovable elements. Institutions like in Gakkou Gurashi can take on the guise of others, and in the show, the group systematizes themselves for the sake of defense, but they do so under the guise of a school club. Megumi maintains her role as a teacher right till the end, refusing to yield her identity to the collapse. And this idea pays off when Yuki sends the zombies away. See, the zombies, while they're vicious and primal, are still under the ever-present thumb of normative influences. Their behaviors are still shackled to repetition, and this behavior is exploited for the girls' safety. And in a way, this portrayal of institutions as devices comes off as a sort of a reflection of an individual's alienation and dependency on these same institutions. See, Gakkou Gurashi is actually quite ham-fisted in its use of the zombie as an allegory. Since the 60s, zombies have been a representation of consumerists, and through the microphone, through the mall, through the little habits that append their sluggish saunters, Yuki saves the day. The show is essentially implying that ongoing institutions today are not only disengaging and anomic, but also a necessary one. And it paints a strikingly grim picture of what the author thinks of society. The show says that these practices are exhausting and can be cumbersome, but they're necessary. That no matter how hard you fight against it, there's a sacred element to these practices, giving peace and security. When you construct a narrative, there are 2 major things you want to focus on. What is the chronological order of the story you're telling, and what is the order you plan on presenting it? The former is called FABULA, and the latter is called SYUZHET. In the first half, Gakkou Gurashi sequences its major parts by time, separating each major distinction by presentation over chronology. It does so for 2 reasons. The first is to make you interested in the story. For instance, the twist, while it comes off as a little cheap, does work. The second is to truncate time. Within the first 6 episodes, Gakkou Gurashi happens within 2 spaces of time. The first is the modern day, which follows the girls at the school, and the second is Miki, who's at the mall. To get to those episodes, we look at their backstories, the purpose of which is to contextualize the events that happened in the previous episodes. For instance, by showing Miki first and then having her backstory later, we not only save time, but it also defines her without needing us to guess at her character. When we look at her backstory, our brains fill in the blanks between her time at the mall and her time now. Instead of needing to spend a long time leading up to her character, the show can just show her character, show her backstory, provide an incredibly short transition sequence, and then we have a full picture of who she is. If she was shown chronologically, we'd respond better to clear causal beats, which could take more time. Second, while the outbreak happens before the events of the first episode, choosing to show the first episode in that state allows us to more easily enter Yuki's headspace. It shows to a fairly compelling extent just how warped Yuki's sense of reality is, simply because we haven't yet been exposed to a neutral third-person narrative vantage point. Having a misleading post-apocalyptic event in the show as the first episode implicitly states, "I am lying to you." It trains us not to trust it. So when it ramps up the visual cues in the second half, we get worried, and that's where we get into the really interesting mise-en-scène. At the heart of Gakkou Gurashi is how it shows this dilemma, and I'd argue no show in summer 2015 is as willing to experiment and play around with the mise-en-scène as Gakkou Gurashi. The mise-en-scène, in short, is pretty much where everything is a shot goes, where you put things, how things are lit, blocking, props, etc. It's all part of the mise-en-scène. As the story progresses, Gakkou Gurashi's mise-en-scène becomes more precise. It adapts an increasingly complex visual grammar by reincorporating items from previous scenes. For instance, when you look at the use of daisies in the third episode, the glass is used as a visual cue that something has happened to Megumi's co-worker. When it's first introduced, its purpose is a setup. When you go to a later episode, you see that the daisies are in the center where Yuri and Megumi are discussing the creation of the school living club. Having them frame opposite each other with speaking headroom allows the show to do two things. One, it gives them enough breathing space to have a conversation without making it feel like something is amiss or claustrophobic. And two, it keeps the daisies in mind. The flowers are facing each girl in the scene. The fallen petals show loss. In the language of flowers, daisies mean innocence. By having the daisies lose their petals, it shows that the girls are losing their innocence. It implies that this is the exact moment where they completely understand, the necessary steps to their own continued survival, and it paints the decisions to make the club a highly grim and pragmatic one. It's in these little moments that the show really shines, and charting the flowers, we saw it initially as a way to show something has happened, to how it's a commentary on something that is happening, and it's applicable to a lot of things in the show. But even if we aren't looking at reincorporated clues, we can see how arrangement matters. The bare windowsill magnifies the lingering shots of the wilting primrose lilacs. The yellow of their pajamas magnifies the light of the lamp, leaving the girls enveloped by darker blues and blacks and walled off by their shadows. After Kay leaves, the bottle-filled, lived-in room is clean, reflecting the emptiness Miki feels at Kay's absence. And much of this is more than just window dressing. It tells us little bits and pieces about the story. Whether it's the references to Stephen King to foreshadow Yuki taking off her hat as a metaphor for her losing her docility, or the music player as a symbol of fantastical hope, Gakkou Gurashi plays and incorporates visual tics to describe a living world among the dead. Gakkou Gurashi, on a higher abstract level, incorporates the monomyth. Central to the story is the theme of failure, a staple of most apocalyptic fiction. The government fails the city, Megumi fails to get the cure in time, Yuri fails to go through with her promise. The girls fail to get in contact with the outside world, Kurumi fails to save Taromaru, and Miki fails to follow Kei. And yet, for all of its hardships, the show doesn't ramp up a lot of tension until the latter episodes. Underlying Gakkou Gurashi's failures is the transient nature of failure itself. While there are moments where failure affects the group with lasting scars, most instances of failure are temporary. Kurumi survives because Yuri failed. The zombies are driven away despite the barricade failing. Taromaru saves Yuki despite them failing to save him. At its heart, graduation is a ritual of change. All the girls change. Miki grows from an observer to an active participant. Yuri's ability to maintain the group's cohesion is tested. Yuki begins to slip out of her psychosis. And Kurumi goes from a girl with a tragic past to the group's emotional rock. It emphasizes that no matter the calamity, it's never the end. It references Hojiki, which describes natural disasters as a message about impermanence. And at the end of the day, Gakkou Gurashi's message, for all of its grimness, is a standard, stoic, uplifting one. Never give up. Don't give up, because these sufferings and tribulation are ultimately impermanent. And it's for those reasons that I'm a huge fan of Gakkou Gurashi. It doesn't hit the mark all the time, and I'm sure I'm probably reaching a bit too far, looking at a bit too much in what is otherwise little innocent quirks, but I honestly don't think so. Animation has the luxury of composing scenes from scratch. You don't have the rigors of whether actors, natural versus unnatural lighting. You don't need to set up dollies or tracks. You construct the world and how it's portrayed, and while I understand that there are some restrictions, it's quite a free environment for commercial artistry.